Good evening and welcome to the new Zoom Bible study on the Gospel of Mark. Thank you for taking the time to watch tonight's lesson, and I hope that you will be blessed by it. I'm really excited about teaching a Bible study on the Gospel of Mark. It has certainly become my favorite of the Synoptic Gospels, and I think we'll have a good time studying Mark. It is the shortest of the gospel, and it's very fast paced, but I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you are too. As I mentioned in last week's study, this won't be a chapter by chapter or verse by verse study. If we did that, even though Mark's gospel is the shortest, it would still take us almost a year. So instead, each week I'll be summarizing 2 or 3 chapters each lesson, and then highlight the pivotal events and try to do all of that in approximately 15 minutes. Last week, I shared a few reasons of why the Gospel of Mark is important, and I also shared the subversive message of the opening verse, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Tonight, I want us to go a little bit further as the Gospel of Mark continues, and right after the opening line, Mark wastes no time and gets right to it. As I said last week, there's an urgency in his message. And so Mark begins, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight." Now, the way that Mark records it, it is as if all of verse 2 and 3 come from Isaiah. However, only verse 2 is from Isaiah 40, verse 3 to be exact. And verse 3, Mark chapter 1, verse 3, is actually Malachi 3:1. Now, I don't know if Mark just got carried away with excitement and forgot to mention that verse 3 is actually from Malachi, or I don't know what happened, but he did mess up on the biblical reference. The most important thing about that opening passage is how it serves to introduce one of the major themes in the Gospel of Mark. The word way is repeated twice, followed by the word path. And both words are words that invoke the ideal of a journey. And that's one of the ways that Mark presents the story of Jesus. The outline of the Gospel of Mark follows the journey of Jesus to Jerusalem. The first third of the book centers around Jesus's activities in Galilee. Then the middle third focuses on Jesus's journey to Jerusalem. And then the last third records the final week in Jerusalem, which of course focuses on the crucifixion and resurrection. And on this journey from Galilee to Jerusalem, all along the way, people are called to follow in the way of Jesus. And over, we will hear Jesus say, "Follow me." Now, the Gospel of John, for instance, emphasizes the word believe. The Synoptic Gospels don't really do that. Instead, they emphasize the call to follow Jesus. And over again, we are going to hear Jesus say, "Follow me." Marcus Borg, in his commentary on the Gospel of Mark, writes this: the Gospel as the way of Jesus, and remember, Mark is emphasizing way. The Gospel as the way of Jesus suggests a path and a person to be followed, and not primarily a set of beliefs to be believed. Verses 2 and 3 are not simply Mark's introduction to John the Baptizer. Rather, they sound the theme of Jesus as the way of the Lord. and he calls people to follow the way that he taught and that Mark saw revealed in him. We are then introduced to John the Baptizer, and we are told about how he dressed and that how he proclaimed a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And then we're also told that John pointed to the one who is coming. But tonight's pivotal event is Jesus's baptism. And Mark's account begins in verse 9. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove upon him. And a voice came from the heavens, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." Now tonight, I first want to take you to seminary and point out some nuances that I hope you find interesting. And after sharing those nuances, then I'll conclude with some devotional thoughts about Jesus's baptism or takeaways from Jesus's baptism. The first little seminary note is about how the views of Jesus in the early church communities developed and how the Gospel of Mark helps us understand that development. So here's the first seminary lesson. In the Gospel of Mark, we are told that John proclaimed a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And then, as we just read, Jesus comes to John to be baptized, and nothing more is added. So it appears that Jesus accepts John's call to repentance, then gets baptized, and then becomes a disciple of John, at least until John is arrested. The Gospel of Mark doesn't begin Jesus's ministry until we're told that John has been arrested, and then it's Jesus carrying on sort of like the mantle. Now here's the issue. If Jesus was sinless, which is something we believe, and I certainly believe that, then do we have a problem with Jesus submitting to a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sin? If Jesus is sinless, then why did he submit to a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins? Well, a little bit later, we know that Matthew writes his gospel. And evidently, this issue about Jesus's baptism had been discussed. And so to help clarify that Jesus didn't need to be baptized for the forgiveness of sins, Matthew adds a dialogue between John and Jesus. And we find it in Matthew chapter 3, verses 13 through 15. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. Now, if we stopped at verse 13, Matthew is telling us the same thing as Mark does. But then Matthew adds this. John would have prevented him saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." Then he consented. Notice, Jesus doesn't say, "I need to do this for the forgiveness of sin." So the difference between Mark and Matthew tells us that explaining Jesus's baptism was an issue, and it tells us that it became more important for the church to present Jesus being baptized as part of God's plan and to show by Jesus's baptism allegiance to God's righteousness rather than for the forgiveness of sin. Now that's a development, and Mark helps us to see that development. The second seminary lesson is that Mark helps us to track how the church's beliefs about the divinity of Christ developed. So the question is, when is it that Jesus is declared to be the Son of God? Now, the Apostle Paul gives us the earliest of all Christian writings. Paul was most likely dead by the time that the Gospel of Mark was written. And so all of Paul's letters predate all of the Gospels. And of course, Mark is the earliest of those. Well, in Romans 1, so this is earlier than the Gospel, in Romans 1, Paul writes that Jesus was declared to be the Son of God by the resurrection from the dead. Then the Gospel of Mark, as we just read, Mark, the earliest gospel, moves that declaration back to Jesus's baptism. It's at Jesus's baptism that we're told that Jesus is God's Son. But then Matthew and Luke move it back even further by giving us the Christmas stories that present Jesus as the Son of God, not at his baptism, not only at his baptism, but at his birth. And then the last of the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark, moves it back even further by presenting the pre-existent Jesus as divine. And we all know the familiar words of John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word, which is Jesus, was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. So the Gospel of Mark helps us in understanding how the early church's view of Jesus developed. The divinity of Christ became more and more important as the years passed and as Christianity expanded. And this, let me clarify something. This doesn't mean that no Christians believed in the divinity of Christ early on. Rather, what we're seeing with the Gospel of Mark is that it simply shows how this belief developed, or at least how it developed in written records. And I believe that the more we understand about our faith and how it developed, the better off we are. Now, end of seminary. Now on to more devotional thoughts about the baptism of Jesus. And let me pull it back up for us. We go back to Mark chapter 1 now, verse 9. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove upon him. And a voice came from the heavens, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." Now, while you're still looking at it on your screen, when Jesus is baptized, note that Jesus saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. Well, first of all, this is a fulfillment of Isaiah 64, which says, "Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down." And so Mark presents the story of Jesus' baptism as a fulfillment of that prayer in Isaiah. But I want us to focus on the torn apart part. In the Greek, it is all one word. And Mark deliberately uses the Greek word schizo to describe the tearing apart of the heavens. Schizo is a term that denotes vigor and high energy. Is actually a violent term, as in breaking and entering. And so what Mark is teaching us is that it is at Jesus's baptism that we see our God radically committed to the act of breaking and entering into the world. And the only other time that Mark uses schizo is at the end of his gospel when he describes the temple curtain, the curtain to the Holy of Holies, of being ripped apart, torn open, schizo, as Jesus is crucified. And so by doing that, Mark again makes the point that God is tearing down all barriers between humanity and God's self through Jesus. So in a way, Mark's gospel begins and ends with schizo. God is tearing apart the heavens in order for us to be reconciled. And to quote Saint Diana of Ross here in the Zoom Bible study, as I like to do any chance I get to in the pulpit, ain't no mountain high enough, ain't no valley low enough, ain't no river wide enough to keep God from getting to you. And I know I just said that I'm done with the seminary lessons tonight, but here's one more little bitty lesson. In Mark chapter 1, the verb schizo is in the present passive tense, which means this tearing apart of the heavens by God is ongoing. It is not a completed action. It continues. It's not a one off and done. It continues even when it involves our baptisms. See, the story of Jesus's baptism in the Gospel of Mark speaks to us as we reflect on our own baptism, because God does continue to tear open the heavens for us. And it doesn't matter whether you were baptized as an infant or as a child or as a teen or as an adult. And it doesn't matter if your baptism took place in a baptismal font or a glass dish with water, in a church baptistry with warm water, or a creek with cold water, whether it took place in a river or ocean, in a swimming pool, in a bathtub, or a bathtub. No matter the circumstance, and no matter the place, and no matter when, the baptism, at the moment that you were baptized, God tore apart the heavens and proclaimed you as beloved. It is at our baptism that we are marked with the sign of God's own love and claiming. Think of baptism as God's watermark in our lives. The definition of a watermark, according to Webster, is a faint design in some paper or photograph during its manufacturing. And that mark is visible when held against the light, and it typically identifies the maker. And so our baptism, as was with Christ, is God's watermark of identification in our lives. We are forever marked as God's own, and we are marked as forever in God's love. So until next week, God's grace and peace to you.